Now, with 35 people doing different kinds of things in different places, which bits, which pieces do we present to you is going to be a big challenge. So what we did actually is to set up some of the work on panels. You can see some of the sites. Um, you can ask people at the desk which are the panels at which that material is displayed. But beyond that, to say that we have arrived at some kind of a conclusive canonical text where we can say that this is our big thesis about tacit knowledge is actually impossible at this point of time. So let me just very quickly start with what the founding idea was. The founding idea of the Tacit Urban Knowledge Network was the way in which Michael Polanyi described tacit knowledge in the context of scientific knowledge. That is, knowledge, breakthroughs in knowledge do not come in an additive way. That is, it is not as if you have X amount of knowledge and then you add one more piece to it and it becomes X plus 1, and then you add one more to it and it becomes X plus 2. That is not how it happens. What actually happens in scientific innovation is that there is a lot of tacit knowledge, that is knowledge that you hold without actually articulating it. And that source of that knowledge could be all kinds of cultural experiences, personal experiences. It could be coming from value systems. And it is that material which pushes through at some point of time to result in that kind of a breakthrough. Now that basically means that each individual researcher is coming into this with a set of a certain endowment of something called tacit knowledge and plays with it, deploys it in the field in which he or she is operating. What we try to do is to push that a little bit and ask this question as to the endowment of this individual person. Is it really a personal endowment? Is it something that is collectively held? If it is collectively held, collectively produced, then in what ways does it actually get produced in particular places? How does it travel? Who holds it for what purposes? What happens with that knowledge? Now, when I frame it in this particular way, it looks very, very abstract. But to give simple examples, every town in India has a number of households which are not connected to the sewer network. You just look at the census data, you know how many households are not connected to the sewer network. What we don't know is, what do they do with their septage? Where does it go? Right? Yet, if you go to any town in India, you will also see on the walls, as you are approaching the town, advertisements written in white paint, which give you the mobile phone number of some guy who can build a septic tank and clean it. It's the same pattern in every town across India. How does that happen? Building a septic tank in a particular area is a highly localized knowledge, and yet you see the same pattern repeating everywhere. So does this knowledge travel through a manual somewhere? Does it travel through personal networks? What happens? How does it actually work? Once we started digging into it, we decided that we are going to be doing this at the scale of the house, at the scale of the neighborhood, and at the scale of the bigger structures in which people find work, employment, opportunities of various kinds, and so on. That was the broad framing. And a key note, which Partha Mukhopadhyay, who is sitting at the back, constantly keeps reminding of, is that the proof of the network is that it works. That somehow, the idea of the network is something which is always up for grabs. We keep defining and redefining it. How do we meet each other? How do we talk to each other? How do we get under each other's skins? How do we tap into each other's memories, each other's traumas, without actually walking over the other person, right? The other institution, because we are all parts of different kinds of institutions. And that reminds me actually of a research project in which we worked earlier, where we defined the problem of our cities in a very peculiar way. What we started off with is this idea that in many of our cities, we have these places where people walk all over each other. They're not under any pressure to present themselves as per a CV template that you can download from the web. But we don't trample upon each other, right? Somehow we kind of learn to jostle with each other and survive. And places of that kind, of some kind of collective existence, are breaking down. So what do we do? How do we figure out how to live with some sense of a collectiveness? That was one of the ways in which we framed it, right? So that's what was one of the threads, at least, that kept us going. And we did a number of very interesting experiments in all of this. We looked at archives, which Ramaswamy will tell you in a little bit time. We looked at how financiers evaluate who is creditworthy and who is not creditworthy. We looked at how people make investments in their own houses over a long period of time, and at what point of time do they gain the confidence that that house is theirs, even if they don't have any papers. Somehow people seem to be building up enough confidence that this city belongs to me, this place belongs to me, this house belongs to me, and if anybody pushes me out of here, I'm ready to fight for it, right? Where does that come from? That was the kind of things that we kept pushing for. And in that sense, this was largely about crafting a certain kind of urban sensibility and awareness of the fact that we know a lot. We don't know, we do not necessarily always find it useful to codify it. And yet, if we do not codify it, if we do not make it explicit, if we don't know how to talk about it, then we are possibly running into major disasters. So how do we safeguard ourselves from disasters, and how do we deploy the knowledges that we have to something that can be collectively good for everyone, right? So in that sense, crafting that sensibility was one important aspect of all of our work. And in another sense, a lot of our work was about crafting methodologies, because how do you actually do research of this kind? What questions do you ask? What kinds of concerns do you go into the field with? How do you take on board the concerns of other people when you are doing the research, right? So all of those things became questions for us. So I'll stop here and ask Mukta to speak about her experience of being in the network, of being pissed off with all of us.
So, so Anant was right. When we first started the project, we all sort of got a document, which was the proposal of the project. We tried to outline the kind of questions that was being asked, the premise of the project. And we have a team of young researchers, and everybody was running around saying, sounds very exciting, but how do I find the tacit? Where is this tacit? What is this tacit? And I think it took a little while for us to understand that what we need to do is actually read between the lines of what we ourselves have already written, done, talked about. So it was a little bit of a self-introspective process that researchers then, after a few months, a year into the project, got used to doing. So a year into the project, people would return from field work, which may or may not have been part of this project per se, with observations like, I found this and I think this is the tacit question. So that was really where we started seeing some of the intersections, and what they were really struggling with. And I'm talking mostly from field stuff that I've done or I've done in conjunction with colleagues, is how do you read between the lines when you're interacting on the field? Is what you're being told the entire story? What are the kind of stories that people are happy telling, and what are the kind of stories that exist but will not be told to you initially? So there was a constant question of you and your position and your ability to do what you do as researchers in the field. And about motivation. So what is the motivation behind what is being told to you? So what happened is that we started, normally you go into the field and you come back and you write field notes, and I think a lot of us actually reached out to anthropologists we know, and many of us don't come from disciplines like that, like I'm an architect planner, but we started reaching across disciplines to try and understand different techniques of doing things that we found ourselves not equipped to do. So for example, after demonetization, I work in rental housing. I try to understand something about informal rentals. And when I was walking around my field sites, asking landlords, कि cash नहीं है तो क्या करोगे अब? Because all the rent is transacted in cash. And all the landlords I met would give me very bland answers like, कोई बात नहीं, 3 महीने बाद दे देंगे. And which is sort of was running contradictory to what you know about them from previous interactions where they were knocking at the door at the end of every month to collect rent, and you're wondering, is this a coping mechanism or what? And then only later did other kind of narratives begin to emerge of a certain kind of fear, a certain kind of morality of who's the good citizen, and therefore how are we expected to behave by the state in a situation when such a thing has been imposed on us. But these kind of questions, initially when we did the research, we did not see these narratives. It's only when this project started and we went back to field notes that were done, of research that was done before, that we started reading certain patterns and then went back to field sites a year or two after that and asked questions about demonetization ke baad kya hua, GST ke baad kya hua, and then stories came out about how we have now PAN cards. Even though we don't file taxes, we have PAN cards because a PAN card is somehow for them a proof of being a good citizen or being part of the financial system. So what I'm trying to say essentially is that the question of the tacit actually enabled us to dig deeper into the work that we were already doing. So it wasn't necessarily a fresh set of questions, but a way to sort of go a little deeper into the questions we were already asking. The second thing that I found a lot of people struggling with was categories. So, for example, I work also in migration, and there's constant conversation about who is a migrant. Everybody would and everybody's always confused about who's defining a migrant in what way. So there's the question of definition, there's a question of measurement, and there's a question of meaning. So again, trying to understand, is the way you define or understand migrant dependent on the question that you're asking? So for example, if I'm studying identities, then maybe my migrant is somebody who could have come 40 years ago, but that's not the definition I might use if I'm trying to understand whether services are accessible to people or not. So is that flexibility something that is kosher in the research world? Was also a question that a lot of people were asking. Are we allowed to ask a question like this? Are we allowed to change definitions and categories at will? So a lot of uncomfortable questions, I think, were coming to the fore, and people were asking questions about intermediate definitions. Can we create intermediate categories now as placeholders and then go back on them later when we actually discover more? And is that okay to do? And who decides that it's okay to do? So if I publish something today in which I define migrant as X, and then 5 years later, I feel like that was not really the right way to do it, does that actually make me a bad academician or a researcher? Is a question that, those are the questions that were being asked by members of the network, and I think all of these were very productive ways of challenging the structures of knowledge that we've always worked with. So for me, not just as a researcher myself, but also as a member of a team in which all this exciting and frankly very confusing work was happening, these are the abstractions that I'm getting out of it that I'm talking about today.
One of the things that we figured as we kept working on tacit knowledge network projects was that it's actually possible to pick up any project and ask a question about what kind of knowledge are we looking at, right? And that made it possible for us to figure out all kinds of new ways of doing things, figure out new kinds of sites. And Mukta is right, that frankly confusing, it was actually very traumatizing for a lot of us. I remember the times when Kabir, Dipan, Ravi, who were working with us, all trained as architects, going into the field, looking for something that their architectural mind taught them. So you have a certain idea of what a public place is supposed to be. So you go around looking for that public place, and then you try and spend some more time looking at it and say, no, this is not quite what it looks like, and then you don't know what to do. I mean, you're able to draw lots, make lots of drawings, sketches, all of that. It's that drawings that you're making which seem to hold some kind of truth that you don't know what to make of, right? And you come back with that, and that was a very important insight for us, that your field notes, as confused as they might be, as confusing as they might be, the drawings that you make, the pictures that you take, hold a lot of material that you are only able to make sense of when you spend long enough time with that. And that meant that everybody had to constantly produce lots and lots and lots of notes. And there were many, many moments when people would literally give up and say that, no, this is making no sense at all to me, but then come back, go back to it repeatedly, and then begin to make sense of it. So one of the projects that we did in this was something that came out of a conversation that I had with Ramaswamy about 2 or 3 years ago. Bhashwati, me, and Ramaswamy were sitting and talking about what has had happened in our cities. And there was this conversation about how Ramaswamy has never thrown away a piece of paper in all of those years. That every single scrap of paper, meeting agendas, notes, things to do, people to meet, angry outbursts, rants, drafts of reports, all sorts of things, starting from sometime in mid-80s, all of them stored somewhere in trunks. So we just thought that, it might be an interesting idea to just go through it, because this is what is reflecting the trajectory of a particular individual to the extent that it can be held together is there somewhere, and somebody can go and sit and look through it. So somebody went there, sat and worked through it. Bharat is sitting somewhere in this room at the back, and he writes an email to me from Calcutta saying that, I'm looking at this report, which is about labor conditions in a particular settlement of Santhal tribals who had come to Calcutta to work as earth diggers for the metro rail. And as I'm reading it, I'm looking at the metro rail now in Calcutta as a completely unfinished project. Because until I read that, it looked like a finished, settled, big infrastructure. But now that I'm seeing this trace, now that I'm seeing this path through which it came, everything about it looks very fluid and unsettled. And that was a starting point for thinking about how to create a new set of archives, how to tell those stories, and being able to tell these stories so that we can think about the future in a new way. Because the future, ultimately, we may have some kind of a utopian notion, but that utopian notion has to have a concrete story, and that story will have to, for us to be making it convincing enough, it has to start drawing on these threads. And how do you make those connections, and except through these papers? So that's the reason why we wanted Ramaswamy to be speaking here. He spoke about this last year too, and I think it's really, really important for us to think about what is it that we want to forget, what is it that we don't want to forget, what is it that becomes part of what we call tacit knowledge, and where do all these cities' memories actually live?
Thanks. As Anand said, I spoke about this last year at Dodin. This archiving initiative was just 3-4 months old at that time, done by Bharat. So it's more time has passed since then, and more work on that has been done. When we came last year, the work had just been initiated, and Bharat was working on that till the beginning of July and completed a good part. His final task was to purchase 9 steel trunks and put all the papers in them. But there's many more papers still outside the trunks. And we had 2 large rooms full of crates and papers and so on. And now it's 9 trunks and several crates. And then whosever empty office it was that I was occupying shifted all the materials just to one room because they needed those rooms. So I'm terrified to enter that room now because it's just full of things, It's like searching for a needle in a haystack. It terrifies me, all those papers. And then apart from all the papers that were categorized and sorted and so on, there were huge numbers of papers of my own, personal notes and thoughts and reflections and all my study notes and so on. Those have not been sorted. They've just been removed from the general lot and put into other crates. And so when I see them also, I get a nightmare. I have to sort through these, So now I hate paper. I don't want to write down anything. I don't want to take anybody's visiting card. I don't want to take any files from any seminars, nothing, because I know where they all go. So in few months back, Bharat wrote up something about this archive. He begins by asking some questions. How does civic action produce an understanding of the city at particular points in time? How can archival practices excavate and activate these submerged knowledges? So this is very well put. My conversation with Anant 2 years back was that I have this huge bunch of papers that I have to get rid of. I don't know what to do about it. And then he phoned me some months back. He said, you were talking about, sorting those papers and so on. It took me a while to remember what he was talking about. But out of that, then the initiative was started, and Bharat came on board. So what this archive is, basically I returned to India after my studies abroad and in 1984, and then very soon after got into, city activism in Kolkata with the squatters were being evicted. There was an eviction drive by the state government. And so a squatters umbrella organization had been formed in the city. There's one exhibit there about Chinnamul Sramajivi Adhikar Samiti, that is a squatters organization, about how its formation came about and the different streams of people who were in that organization, coming from other backgrounds and other networks and so on. So that was my apprenticeship in city activism, squatter activism. And because I was working with squatters and they were protesting evictions, right then there was a proposed eviction of a large settlement of workers who had prepared the tunnels or dug the earth for the metro works. In those days, there were no machines excavating the earth. It was large numbers of humans from Bihar and Jharkhand who came to do that work. And they stayed in the city for many years, and then when the work was over, their settlement was summarily evicted. So that began my interest in the metro, and with a friend we investigated the working conditions of the laborers on the metro and found that there was gross violation of all labor laws on a public sector project of the Ministry of Railways, including the employment of bonded labor. Workers from Murshidabad in northern Bengal were coming as bonded labor on the metro. And there's a very right-wing BJP politician called Tathagata Roy, who's the governor of Meghalaya now. He was the deputy chief engineer of the metro. And so after we had done all our investigations, we went to meet him to get his response. So he said, this is the way it is. You want to make waves, go ahead. Anyway, we didn't make any waves. Some people took our report and filed a case in the High Court. And I had the pleasure of seeing that man being called to the High Court to respond to the judge's inquiries. But that court finally said that this is not something anything can be done about. It is a structural problem in the country, and which is not going to be solved by righteous eloquence or litigation. So that's it. So that's a good test case of, and I had done that report, and when people filed the case, I took interest in that because something historic had happened just a few years before that, when the Asiad Games of 1982, in order to build all the structures and stadiums and all that, so large numbers of workers were there, and I think People's Union for Democratic Rights did an investigation of Asiad workers, and found that they were all being underpaid and so on. And so a case was filed in the Supreme Court, I think, and the Supreme Court gave a very positive order on that, asking the government to do various things and so on. But that didn't happen in the Calcutta case, so it just died a quiet death. So I was meeting an organization called Unnayan in Calcutta, and they had an excellent library and documentation center. And it was there that, as a complete outsider, I was visiting and studying there every day, where I learnt about things like that Asiad case and so on. And so that inspired me, and then we did the metro workers investigation. And so all those papers of that metro investigation and the case and my networking with the unions at that time, and then they told me about all the efforts of construction labor unions that were already on. There was also something called the National Campaign Committee for a Central Legislation on Construction Labor, something like that, in the mid-80s. So all those papers and all I had accumulated. That's how my entry into activism began. And then there was this always associated aspect of papers getting accumulated. So there was the Calcutta Metro, and then I was involved with the Chinnamul Sramajibi Adhikar Samiti, the squatters organization. And then I joined Unnayan as a full-time member of the organization. And shortly after got involved in another initiative of theirs called the National Campaign for Housing Rights. In the early 80s, there was a famous incident or infamous incident in Bombay with the eviction of pavement dwellers. And a case was filed which ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and that gave its judgment on that in 1985. It was called the Olga Tellis case. Olga Tellis was a journalist who filed a petition on behalf of the evicted pavement dwellers. So Supreme Court held that right to livelihood is part of the right to life, which they recognized and which the petitioners had emphasized. But then they said that the pavement dwellers do not have a right to occupy the municipal pavement, And so they lost. So the years of initiative in Bombay and in other cities of people campaigning against evictions or fighting litigation, so all of that came to a head sort of in 1986, and this National Campaign for Housing Rights was formed with people from various parts of the country. All of whom had been involved in anti-eviction activism, whether in Bombay or Chennai or Bangalore or Delhi or Kolkata. And then once that campaign for housing rights was formed, then there was an evolution of its thinking itself. So going from, somebody said, you're not going to solve the problem of housing by building. So similarly, we learned that housing is not just an urban issue or an issue of urban low-income housing in the rural areas. So by the end of the 80s, we calculated that maybe up to 40% of India's population, and residing mostly in rural areas, is almost entirely outside the cash economy. We had demonetization, and it caused a great disruption to people's life, especially the low income and poor. But 30 years ago, one could say that maybe as much as 40% of the Indian population is largely outside the cash economy. They're residing in rural areas, and they're in subsistence and dependent on the biomass economy. So in a context like that, what does housing mean? It means if your access to biomass resources and forest resources for your housing needs, if you're denied access to those resources, then that is a housing problem. It's not an issue of building housing units in the village. So National Campaign for Housing Rights actually became a countrywide initiative, and in the year 1987, particularly, a very active effort was taken up to block the government's draft national housing policy, which was drafted entirely at the behest of, bureaucrats and builders and so on, and not people. So we were successful in exposing the retrograde nature of the government's draft, and the government was shamed and embarrassed and compelled to make it a more consultative process, and in fact asked the Campaign for Housing Rights to conduct hearings and consultations all over the country, and then bring together all those voices and critical points. So we did that, and so on. But the central focus of the Campaign for Housing Rights was to get a bill of housing rights into Parliament. So there's loads of papers in my collection from that period. Then people may remember the 28th September 1989. I'll never forget that date. There was a huge rally in a town called Harsood in Madhya Pradesh, which no longer exists. It went under the dam water. And so 1989 was the Save Harsood rally. So activists from around the country landed up in Harsood on that date. And we in Unnayyan in Calcutta, in solidarity with that, organized a video documentaries festival on displacement. And from that, a body was formed called Committee for Development Not Displacement, CDND. All those concerned about environmental displacement issues and so on in and around Calcutta were in that organization. And at that time in Jharkhand was not formed as yet. It was part of Bihar, but there had been for several decades a Jharkhand movement happening over there. And around the late 80s, it was the Jharkhand Mukti Morcha that was at the forefront of that Jharkhand statehood movement. So people from that Jharkhand movement somehow connected with this Committee for Development, Not Displacement, and with our help organized a very huge seminar on development, not displacement, as part of the Jharkhand movement. So they saw this as a kind of intellectual legitimization of their movement, and that scholars and activists and academics and so on are also talking about the kinds of issues that they had emphasized in the statehood movement. So all the papers from CDND and the Jharkhand seminar, it was called the Eastern Region Seminar on Development, Not Displacement. And the seminar organizers tried to continue that in the following years. We did it in 1990, and again in 91, 92, they tried to follow with further seminars. Briefly, I was associated with a heritage conservation group in Calcutta called KRUTA, and a gentleman called Debashish Nayak who was associated with it. So he wanted my help to, articulate his views about conservation and neighborhood and community-based urban conservation. So there's the KRUTA papers. There's somebody called Aroma Ravi, who is the head of IIHS. So he was also part of our network in the National Campaign for Housing Rights, and that's when I met him in '87. And he and several of his colleagues, he was then working in development alternatives in Delhi. So he and several of his colleagues left that organization and formed a group called Taru. It was a kind of research-oriented group. And in follow-up to some of the openings that the National Campaign for Housing Rights had made with the new government, that was VP Singh's government that came in '89. So many of the people, MPs and people in that party, and including VP Singh, I think, had supported our campaign for housing rights. So when they came into government, they showed a receptivity. And Aromar and his group took advantage of that to get through a whole series of research studies to be taken up by the Ministry of Urban Development. And so Taru began its work doing those studies. First was in 5 states in the Northeast. They were commissioned by the Planning Commission to look at, to prepare housing action plans for 5 Northeastern states. So there's all that. I became a member of Taru and participated in some of those studies in Tripura and in Orissa. And there was a post-Latur earthquake damage assessment study done by a large group of researchers. So all those papers are there. After I left Unnayan, there was another thing I was involved in. We tried to develop a plan for squatter resettlement in one of the most densely, areas most densely congested with squatters, in the Beleghata Canal side area. So we prepared a plan where instead of pitching it as a squatter resettlement plan, which there would not be any takers for, we called it an inner city renewal plan. So the whole land use of a certain zone in the city was visualized differently, and new built-up area of commercial and residential type was to be created so that the resettlement of squatters who lived on the canal side as well as slum dwellers who lived nearby all could be achieved in the context of a total area renewal project, and it would be a small part of that overall renewal project, and therefore feasible. Land sharing on a large scale, but where the new value and the new properties and the new developments created were of such a large scale that they could easily take in the resettlement component. After finishing that report, I was on such a euphoric high because it was very empowering. All my life I had thought of fighting squatter evictions and what was to be done. But finally here we were visualizing and imagining an alternative, and that seemed like a breakthrough. So I was floating on that euphoric high when I learned that a major planning project was to start in Calcutta for environmental management. It was called the Calcutta Environmental Management Strategy and Action Plan, funded by the British government. So it was a 2-year project that was to look at environmental management in metropolitan Calcutta and prepare a strategy and action plan so that the state government could then carry that forward. So I thought that was a very important juncture. So if I could carry these squatter resettlement and canal side renewal ideas into that project, then it could advance. So I kind of worked my way into that project and became a member of that project team. And that changed me completely. I was so far concerned only with squatters, but in the case of this canal side renewal, I could see that if you want to have squatter resettlement, then you must think of slum redevelopment also. It is only on the redeveloped slum that you have space to give to squatters, and nowhere else in the city was it there. So slum dwellers and looking at slum renewal became the key issue. And it was while working in that SEMSAP project that I came upon a statistic that shook me. It showed that the infant mortality rate in the Muslim population of Howrah was much, much higher than the infant mortality rate in the Hindu population. So subsequently, after further investigation, I realized that it's not so much a Hindu-Muslim differential as a slum, non-slum differential in environmental health. And because most Muslims in Howrah are workers and therefore slum dwellers, and if you look at the Hindu population in Howrah, there are slum dwellers and workers, but also non-workers and middle class and non-slum dwellers and so on. So almost every Muslim in Howrah is a slum dweller, but not almost every Hindu is a slum dweller. So it's basically a slum, non-slum health, environmental health differential. But the final consequence of that was infant mortality. And given that I had young children at that time, that shook me and kind of drove me into a kind of moral fervor of wanting to do something and going against all odds to do it. So once that SEMSAP project was over, in its final stage, I was in charge of a pilot experiment in some slum areas in Howrah. And once that was over, it was seen to be successful. It was trying to implement what we had recommended on a small scale in various slum areas with the community participation to prove that when you want to do something, it's best to do it with community participation and you get better results from that. The idea was that this would be incorporated into government practice subsequently. That didn't happen. The secretary of the environmental department thought that he will become the chief secretary and so he will carry these forward, but he was superseded. He didn't become chief secretary, so this project was put on the back burner. But I had finished that pilot project and it was seen to be successful, and with all the goodwill and contacts and my exposure and entry into that basti, I thought I should continue working there independently and started an organization called Howrah Pilot Project. So that was in 97, and in the following year, 98, we started a school called Talimi Haq School for children who don't go to school. So it's been 20 plus years since then, and that small initiative still continues, and thousands of children in that slum have gone through that school. And those who run the school are important leaders of that community, and they shape the minds and spirits of the children and youth in that basti. So through that, a certain kind of soft power of that organization has been created, with much of the youth of that basti today having directly gone through the hands of our teachers who gave them above all love and affection. So trying to use that moral force of love and inspiration as a means to mobilize community youth and mobilize them to service on behalf of the community, specifically through working in the school as a volunteer teacher and so on. So this is a quick summary of my journey roughly between 1984 and 2006. After the Howrah pilot project and starting the school, I started one more experiment, but that failed. I thought if we could get small slum-based organizations, community organizations, all under one umbrella and work very forcefully and strategically on certain goals and tasks, then in a few years, 5-10 years of doing such work systematically at a citywide level, would achieve all kinds of things for the city and for those slum communities. But that was not to be, because all the organizations that I contacted and met and had meetings with and so on, they were only interested in getting funds. They were not interested in anything other than funds. So give me the money, I'll do what is needed to be done in my basti, and then you can go. They were not interested in strategy or skills or what to do in that basti, and they were not interested in transparency with the local community, you know. The typical outsider comes in, starts an organization with money, where the local community is an instrument for them, for their enrichment. You know, they wanted to go to that model, and I was thinking of something else which seemed to be far-fetched and utopian. My final activist endeavor was in Calcutta. The slums are not just places where people live, but they are also the center of slum manufacturing. A large amount of the city's produce is from the slums, like footwear or garments, or stationery products, and so on. So, and all of these trades and manufacturing activities are highly degraded for a variety of reasons: lack of credit, lack of skill development, lack of marketing opportunities, and so on, and space, and so on, technology upgradation. So some of us conceived of a study that would look at the manufacturing industry, beginning with one or two product categories, look at it, investigate in detail, and prepare a strategy and action plan for structural upgradation of these slum trades. Because a third of the city's population lives in the slum, and so we were talking about the livelihoods of 2 or 3 lakh people, which was from these activities, and these activities had no future. So we submitted a proposal to the New Zealand government. They have a grant scheme where a New Zealand partner and an India partner will do a research study, and the New Zealand government would fund it from their development ministry. So we submitted the proposal, and it took a long time, and then finally they said, your proposal was not accepted because we could not see the link with poverty. So structural upgradation of slum manufacturing had nothing to do with poverty. So I said, yes, you're right. Sorry, I dialed the wrong number, you know. I just laughed that. And all the enthusiasm and energy and fire inside me kind of fizzled out after that, you know. So, so the archive is basically of all the papers and a record of all that I was involved in, and all the other people I was meeting, and organizations I worked with, and so on. For a researcher, for an urbanist, for anybody researching the city, planning for the city, I guess these papers are valuable of informing us about the past. Something I've been telling people recently, that I don't think at a fundamental level in the last 30 years, the issues that we work with, there's not been any significant quantum leap in knowledge. Perhaps we knew more 30 years ago and were more articulate and eloquent and more sharp with facts and data on all that then than now. You know, now nobody cares to read beyond 5 sentences. There people investigated, wrote reports, and so on, and people studied it. They had study circles, they had meetings, there were background papers for a seminar, and there were ferocious debates, and so on. So I think if one has to look at the history of our thinking, the history of our thinking about alternatives, so this archive is also an important base for looking at that, at how our ideas have developed and how there were very powerful, strong analysis and ideas in the past as well. So if we learn from them, we can try to move forward. Thank you.
So the story that Ramaswamy just told us, as captured in the papers, is basically a story of lots of proposals, lots of pathways that seem to be going somewhere or intended to go somewhere, ended up somewhere. Some of them happily, some of them in a heartbreak. All kinds of things have happened. The question that we have been asking ourselves is that, is it really important for us to find these kinds of threads in all our cities? If we think that it is important, then which pieces of this, which threads in this are important for us? Because it's very easy for us to fool ourselves into thinking that all of these things ultimately anyway result in heartbreaks. So why would I even want to get into that? It's also very easy to fool ourselves into thinking that it's very, you know, we can selectively read them and say that, so of course we have one, and so we have a long history of militancy, and let's keep fighting. Both of them would be completely wrong ways of understanding our cities, of our own histories, and so on, as we are realizing now. That we are at the same time thinking that there is something very energetic happening all around us, the same time as when we are feeling totally threatened and scared by what's happening happening all around us. So in a situation like that, what kind of stories do we need to tell ourselves? And what starting points can we find in our own diaries, in our own reports, in our own documents? Where do we find them? How do we put them all together? That is one of the key concerns of the Turn network. I just want to quickly close what we have to say by pointing you to the logo that is on the screen here. That is the logo of the Turn network. And that is designed by Neha, who is probably sitting in this room, unless she's sitting right there. Please stand up. Neha designed the logo. And the idea is that there are all kinds of networks, and we are located at those nodes. Some of those nodes work, some of those nodes blink, some of those nodes burn very brightly, some of them may just disappear at some points of time, but that's what the urban really is all about. How do we make sense of this at this particular point of time, not in any sense of permanency, that because this is an open-ended story, it is going to go on. And I will end this by telling you of one of my conversations with Ramaswamy right in the beginning, which actually asked us to think about this kind of questions, was he told me about this film with Kevin Costner as the hero, A Field of Dreams, in which Kevin Costner goes and builds a baseball field in the middle of nowhere, Iowa wheat fields, in the middle of really nowhere, not knowing who's going to play there. There's nobody around who will play. But he's built it and he's waiting for people to come and play. Right? And that's the kind of idealism, that's the kind of hope and aspiration with which we live. We make things, we build things. Somebody somewhere at some point of time will find use for them. And that's all that we can do. So sorry? Someday will come. Okay, so I'll stop here. If you have any quick questions, we'll take 2 questions because we're really, really running behind schedule.
Yeah, so I think the whole sense-making part of it is what we are struggling with through different parts of the project, but the best that we can do is make sense of it from who we are and where we are now. So, and in the archival project, for instance, the people who are studying the archives or putting it together and structuring it have a different understanding in a temporal sense, a different training than the person who put it together in the first place. There are also interactions, and that's the reason why the network that's where the network kicks in, and sort of our experience with not just having it. You're not alone in this. You're actually bouncing these ideas off of a number of people who come from many different sensibilities, age groups, trainings, orientations. And the whole exercise is about sense making. So, and it's also sort of interrelated to the question about why you're doing what you're doing, and you don't know what you're going to find, so why are you finding it in the first place? So, absolutely. I mean, it's not really one of those things in which you know. So it's not you've not drawn the entire flow diagram before you've started. You have the first few steps, you're delving into it, and then you're sort of building out from that. So it's the reason why we've used words like traumatic is precisely because there is that little bit of an element of jumping into the deep end and then finding your way to sort of swim, and then actually finding that there are ways to make sense of what was apparently not so easy or muddled or whatever. So that's been our experience.
My first quick answer is exactly what Mukta said about why would you do something how would you choose a project if you know that somehow structurally it might fail, right? That's what life is about. You don't know exactly what is going to happen, right? But you do it because you have at this point of time a hunch that this is going to lead to something interesting. Right? Until that moment, it is meaningful, which is the reason why in a lot of the work that we do, we constantly insist that do not be caught up with the final output form. It's your diary entry today which is the most important thing. It's your sketch today which is the most important thing, because that gives you an insight. That gives you the traction, right? So at that moment, it does make sense. Now, we are all of us are trained, all of us are caught up in economies where we need to know what the end game is. But for most people in the world, you don't know what the end game is. You operate tactically, right? 80% of our economy is precisely that. You keep experimenting and things work out, which is what Prasad Shetty was talking about yesterday. You make the master plan, but the plan has to work itself out through all kinds of things that happen in the city. It has to work itself out. There is no other way it can actually be implemented. It's going to be contested, it's going to be broken down, it's going to be altered, it is going to be resutured, all of that will happen. The answer to your question is that that was one of the first things we did, which is to look at who else is thinking about tacit knowledge and why, right? So nursing education people have been looking at tacit knowledge for a long time, because how do you write a manual on how to give an injection? The only way you can teach a nurse how to give an injection is to show her how to do it, let her make a mistake, and then she learns. There's no way you can actually give a foolproof manual to a nurse. It cannot be codified. She has to learn it by doing it, right? So tacit knowledge then, in different disciplines, in different fields, for different reasons, has been understood in many different ways. So in the context of the knowledge economy, management profession has been very worried about workers who have over the years developed a certain kind of knowledge capital leaving the organization. So how am I going to constantly extract knowledge from them, codify it in such a way that when the worker leaves, my capital doesn't walk out along with the worker? It's a big concern for someone who is running a firm. For people in the nursing education, health education, how do you teach people empathy? I can't write a code book on how to be empathetic to someone, right? In tactical studies, how do you decide what to reveal and what not to reveal? Like Chandan was talking about in the morning, you don't know when the money is going to come, but it's not as if you really don't know. You know that it's going to come at some point of time. It's not written down in any agreement anywhere, right? How do people develop these kinds of understandings? Which parts of it can we turn into learning materials for ourselves and for others? If we do not know how to talk about it, right? One fundamental problem about tacit knowledge is that the moment you talk about it, it becomes not tacit. It disappears the moment you talk about it, right? So that's the puzzle, that the object of study disappears the moment you study it. And that's what actually makes it so exciting. It's precisely because of that magical quality of tacit knowledge कि आप हाथ लगाओ तो वो गायब हो गया. है ना? So that's the reason why methodologically it has always been so exciting, because you don't know, and we have actually developed a series of methods. For example, how do you go through all of these papers for which you don't have the state given categories and create categories and classifications and codes? 9 trunks, and this is like Pushpaka Viman, right? Incomplete city. The more you take out, the more is coming in. It just keeps coming in. And it's not just Ramaswamy's own papers. It's material that is coming in from Krishna, somebody else, somebody else, somebody else. Other people who are connected to these lives are saying that ki mere paas hai, mere se baat karo. I'll give you more. So it's a never-ending thing. How do you then, into a never-ending archive, create categories provisionally for now? Which is when we realize that a lot of the archiving work that needs to be done today in the contemporary context for our work is also curating work. I have to immediately put it together to make sense towards a particular project, even as I am generating the archive. And the process of generating the archive is in itself generating an archive, because all of those troubled notes from Bharat to me about the dust, about the allergies, about the headaches, about the room, about the streets, It's a new archive. How do you put it together? There's no one right way of doing it.
That's okay. And that's okay.
So learning that confidence, that it's okay, has been the biggest lesson of this. So I'll stop here.